Hi, everybody, and welcome to part two of this week's lecture. What we're going to be focusing on today is going to be carbohydrates. So what our goal today is we're going to try to go ahead and describe the role of carbohydrates in living organisms. So exactly why are they so important? What are we trying to do with them? And how are they going to help us in our daily lives? We're also going to be listing the different classes of carbohydrates and their functions. So remember, carbohydrates, we have three different types. We have our monosaccharides, our disaccharides, and our polysaccharides. So we're going to see what the differences between those are and what they're exactly going to be doing for us in our body. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look of exactly what carbohydrates are going to be and what their roles are going to be for our human body. So when it comes to carbohydrates, it's going to be our primary source of energy to allow us to fuel cellular work. So carbohydrates, remember, are just going to be our carbs, and they're going to be very energy dense. So that means they're going to have tons and tons of energy. Again, provide energy for living organisms, and usually it's going to be in the form of glucose. And in this case, glucose is going to be our monomer, or in this case, our smallest form. Now, they are going to be very essential for the human diet. Again, carbohydrates can be found in grains, fruits, vegetables, and many other processed foods. Now, when it comes to carbohydrates, we do have three different types. We have our monosaccharides, our disaccharides, and our polysaccharides. And again, all of this right here is just telling us how many individual pieces we have. Remember, our monomer is just one piece. And then in order to create more polymers, we just add a bunch of these together in order to produce larger chains. So in this case, our monosaccharide, so our prefix mono meaning one, saccharide is sugar or something sweet. So in this case, it's just one singular sweet piece. Our disaccharide, just like a pair of dice, are going to come in two. And in this case, saccharide sweet, meaning we have now two pieces. And then poly, just like polydactyly, meaning you have many different fingers, more than five. It is going to be more than two. So again, our monosaccharide, mono meaning one, di, which is two, and then poly, more than two. All right, so let's go ahead and now check out exactly what type of carbohydrates we can typically see in our everyday diet and see exactly where they show up when it comes to food. Now, glucose, as you know, is going to be one of the most common sugars that we can find in many different things, and it's going to be also known as dextrose. So glucose, if we go ahead and take a look at our example here for Lucky Charms, if we go ahead and look at our ingredients list, you can see that it contains whole grains, oats, sugar, oat flour, corn syrup, modified starch, cornstarch, and then dextrose right here. So we can see that dextrose, which again is our glucose, which is our monomer, can be found in these Lucky Charms. Fructose is going to be another common sugar, and typically these can be found in food and drinks. If we look at this example over here for this Pepsi, you can see that our first ingredient is carbonated water, and then our second ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. Sucrose. Sucrose is going to be known as a disaccharide, and the reason why it's known as a disaccharide is because we're taking two monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, and adding them together in order to produce sucrose, or in this case, regular table sugar. High fructose corn syrup is just going to be a 50-50 mix of glucose and fructose. And then our starches are going to be one of our first polymers we're going to be talking about. And what that's going to mean is we're going to be taking many different monosaccharides to create a polysaccharide. And in this case, it's going to be a polymer of glucose. And then finally, our fiber and cellulose right here can be found in plants and primarily going to be used for structure for them. Now, one thing that's important when it comes to fiber is our body can't really digest this into glucose. So what's going to happen is it's going to help with our bowel movements. So again, it's going to be optimal for digestive health. All right, so now that we went ahead and looked at carbohydrates, looked at the different categories, and looked at its uses for every day, let's go ahead now and check out our simple sugars. And what does that exactly mean? When it comes to simple sugars, we have two different types. Monosaccharides, remember mono meaning one, And our disaccharides, di meaning two. So in this case, our monosaccharide, we have one unit, which will make it. And our disaccharide, we need one of each of those units in order to give us two, which is our disaccharide. So remember, mono meaning one, saccharide, sweet, sugar. These are going to be some examples of our monosaccharides. You can see that fructose is just a singular unit, which is why we have it as a monosaccharide. Glucose is going to be another monosaccharide, again, one unit. And then finally, galactose, another monosaccharide. When it comes to disaccharide, remember di means two. Just like a pair of dice, two of these pieces are going to produce our disaccharides. So what's going to happen is we're going to covalently bond them together. And in this case, in order to produce sucrose, we're just taking one fructose and one glucose, and we're adding them together to produce our disaccharide, sucrose. Same thing with this, our lactose, which is our milk sugar. We're taking glucose and adding it with galactose. So we're taking one piece and one piece, adding them together to produce lactose. All right, so now we've identified monosaccharides, we've identified disaccharides, we've identified how they kind of bond together, and we've identified exactly how those pieces come together. Now we're going to look at how carbohydrates how are we going to synthesize and hydrolyze them. So what this basically means is how our body's going to use them and what are we going to do once we eat them. So as you know, our monosaccharides are made up of monomers that can make up our carbohydrates. And whenever a human body wants to break this down, remember we're going through a process known as hydrolysis. Hydrolysis, remember hydro meaning water, so H2O, and this is going to be in the presence of water. So what's going to happen is when you eat a carbohydrate, you can see it's going to be in a chain like this. Remember hydrolysis, we're adding water to break apart all of these covalently bonded pieces. And now we have tons of our monomers. So now we have a ton of monosaccharides. And then what's going to happen after that is after we've broken these down, our body is going to go ahead and use these as building blocks to build specific carbohydrates that we need. So remember, we're going to do that through dehydration synthesis. Remember, dehydration, once you're very dehydrated, you are missing water. So same idea, we're subtracting H2O and synthesizes to make. So we're removing water to make something new. So in this case, you can see that we have something completely different than what we initially started out with. Again, that's typically what our body will do. We'll go ahead and take in a bunch of these building blocks, break them down, and build them up into things that we need. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at our complex sugars. When it comes to complex sugars, it's always going to be our polysaccharides. So poly is going to mean many, and then saccharide, remember, is sweet. So the way that this is going to work is you're just going to be linking tons of simple sugars together in order to produce these polysaccharides. So an example here is going to be glucose. If we go ahead and link a ton of these glucoses together, we can end up with something known as starch. And starch is going to be primarily the way that plants are going to store energy. So we can find these in things like rice, grains, and potatoes. They're going to be very starchy, meaning they have lots of energy. Glycogen. If we add a bunch of these glucoses together and put it in this specific orientation, we end up with glycogen. And this is just the way that animals or humans are going to store energy. So our glycogen can be typically found or stored in the liver right here, as well as our skeletal muscles, which are going to be right here. Finally, if we go ahead and take a ton of glucoses and put them together like this, you'll notice that we are ending up with fiber or cellulose. Now, these are going to be very important for plants because it's going to provide support for them. And although we can't necessarily break these down, and whenever we do ingest these, we do get a little bit of energy from them, they're not going to be optimal for our digestion, but it's going to be great for our digestion health, meaning it's going to help with our bowel movements. So let's go ahead now and take a look at our digestion and absorption and use. So how are we actually taking in some of this energy and what are we doing with it? So looking at this chart over here, you can see we have our carbohydrates right here. You can see we have the way it's being broken down, how it's going to be absorbed in our small intestines, the transportation method, and then eventually the end product. So when it comes to our carbohydrates, remember we have our mono/di, known as our simple sugars, and then we also have our polysaccharides. So mono, one, di, two, poly is going to be many, more than two. So in this case, you can see we have our glucose, which is our monomer. So we have our one piece. When we're digesting this, it's already in the smallest form, so we don't really need to do much to it. So our glucose can stay glucose. It's going to get absorbed in our small intestines, into our blood, and exactly into the cells that it needs to be stored in or used. Sucrose, now we're dealing with our disaccharides. Now remember, we're still in our simple sugars, but in this case, we have covalently bonded ones. In this case, we have our glucose and our fructose. We want to break this apart. Remember, we're going to use H2O to do so. And now we're in our monomers, and it's going to be easy to break down now. So now it's going to go to our small intestines right here. And again, you can see it's going to be broken down or transported by our blood and taken wherever it needs to be taken. Same thing with lactose. We have a disaccharide, 1, 2. We're going to break these apart using water. Now we have glucose and galactose, same thing, small intestines, transported with the blood, and then ultimately delivered where it needs to go. Now starches, this is going to be our first poly. And you can see it's very, very energy dense, tons and tons of glucoses. Again, we're going to use H2O to break that apart, and we're going to break it apart into a bunch of different glucoses to be absorbed in the small intestines, transported through the blood, and taken wherever it needs to go. Now remember, fiber and cellulose, very dense. We can't really break this down. So this, unfortunately, is not going to really be absorbed in the small intestines. It's not going to really be transported by the blood, and it's not going to really go anywhere. But remember, it is going to be really good for eliminating waste. All right, and that is going to conclude the lecture for carbohydrates. So what I want you to do now is I want you to go ahead and take a couple minutes, see if you can answer the following questions. I'll give everybody a couple seconds to pause this video, and then we'll come back together as a class. All right, welcome back, and let's check out those answers. In number one, it says, which of the following are not major macromolecules? Remember, macromolecules are big, important ones for life. Lipids is going to be one. Carbohydrates is going to be one. Proteins and nucleic acids. You can see that glucose and glycogen are going to be part of carbohydrates. So these two are not macromolecules. Which of the following is/are not organic compounds? Explain your reasoning. So remember, when it comes to organic compounds, we need that special element, which is going to be carbon. In this case, we know that all macromolecules are going to contain this carbon. So we know proteins, macromolecule, it's going to have it. We know lipids are going to have it as well. We know carbohydrates are going to have it. Water, H2O, does not have carbon. So that is going to be an inorganic compound. Which of the following are examples of carbohydrates? Again, DNA is not protein and fatty acids. Those are all different macromolecules. We're looking at the specific macromolecule carbohydrates. So we know glucose, starch, and cellulose are going to be those. Which of the following are examples of monosaccharides? Remember, mono meaning one. In this case, glycogen is not. It's going to be a polymer. Cellulose, polymer. Sucrose and lactose are going to be disaccharides. Fructose is in fact going to be our only monosaccharide because it is our monomer or a smallest form or just one unit. Which of the following are examples of polysaccharides? Remember, poly meaning many. We know lactose, fructose, and sucrose. Those all are going to be either monosaccharides or disaccharides. We know that glycogen is going to be one, and we know fiber is going to be one as well. Finally, which of the following are examples of disaccharides? Remember, di meaning two. We know cellulose is not, glycogen and fructose are not. Those are all going to be poly or they're going to be mono. In this case, sucrose and lactose are going to be our disaccharides. All right, and that does conclude our test your knowledge portion. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out. And I will see you in the next part.